Welcome to our study of Omniscient Jigme Lingpa's Treasury of Precious Qualities. So we'll begin with the invocation. The source and love of compassion for all beings, who knows all that is knowable, emanation of Longchenpa, heir to a treasury of mind telmas, sky-like yogin of the vast expanse of luminosity, Jigme Lingpa, at your feet we pray. So in the text, the text is divided into three, and this is quite normal within the way that the texts are divided within Indo-Tibetan Buddhism. These three, in fact, the three really consist of the first chapter, which has to do with the, what is it again? We have it as the, what is it again? Yeah, turning the mind to Dharma. So that's the first part. That's chapter one, the value of the human existence, and that is appreciating the enormous fortune that we have in the human rebirth. Then part two is then the incentive for practice, which is the reflection on the impermanence of our existence. And then part three is then the rest of the book. So it's not as if when we say the book has three parts, that they're equally divided. So the part three then is the gradual path, and that's very often how we define the entire Indo-Tibetan Buddhist tradition in terms of the gradual path. And this gradual path consists then here defined in terms of three kinds of beings. The path of beings of lesser scope is really about the spiritual path as enabling higher rebirth. So that's the beings of lesser scope, simply just wishing for happiness, freedom from suffering. There's then the beings of the medium scope, are those beings who wish to be free from the cycle of confusion, the cycle of samsara, liberation. And you can say that's a higher vision. That's really looking into how does it all fit together, and trying to understand reality. And it's that spiritual journey which is about us wishing to be, well, essentially understanding the nature of reality and then wishing to be free from confusion altogether. And that's where the scope really is then freedom from conditioned existence. But that's not the greatest aspiration. The greatest aspiration is then that which extends just beyond the limitation of the ordinary self, and understanding, freeing ourselves from the, you could say, constraint of the in the ordinary perception we have of ourselves, which is very much tied up with this confused attachment to and projection about the solidity of the self and also phenomena. And that the freedom from that really entails no longer being bound by just the agenda of self, and no longer being bound by the confused dualistic projection in terms of an inherently truly existing world as solid. And that brings about a completely different vision, a completely different view, and particularly brings about a different practice in which the scope really is about no longer limited to just self, but also really embracing all living beings. And that's where the greater scope is then wishing enlightenment for all sentient beings. And there's no longer a notion that enlightenment is just retreating into an ultimate peace. So we're going to be getting to that. But anyway, presently within the path of beings of lesser scope, we're looking at then basically what are the actions that drive suffering and what are the actions that drive happiness. So we are essentially looking at what we call the law of karma. But we've looked at now the negative actions, and now we're going to be looking at positive actions. So as always, when we're engaging with this kind of study, recognizing the value of this in terms of addressing the actual core cause of suffering universally, namely the ignorance that fails to understand where our delusional projections and essentially understanding how our existence consists of delusion, and understanding how this nature, by, you could say, by its very nature, it drives suffering. So that's where, when we look around the world and we have this altruistic urge to get to the bottom of suffering and wishing to free others from suffering, then of course we should do whatever we can within the capacity that we have on a relative level, in terms of just providing safety, providing freedom from discomfort, and so forth, to provide happiness in whichever way we can. But the real core cause of suffering universally is this delusion. So we bring to this project this recognition that the study of Dharma is really getting to the bottom of things, not just, to say, patching up immediate conditions of suffering, but also getting to the very core of suffering. So that's the motivation that we bring to both the study and also the practice of the Buddha's teaching. So that's, with that motivation, then we engage in the actual study. So here in verse 39, then it says, "And so, in this condition of impure perception, the path of tenfold virtue leads to higher realms. Embrace, therefore, 10 virtuous acts, and from the 10 non-virtues turn away." So when we say this condition of impure perception, we actually mean that as deluded sentient beings, we're actually not seeing straight. We're not seeing clearly. And samsara is essentially a set of of perceptions which are founded on this dualistic condition of solidifying the subjective experience of our consciousness, where consciousness is taken to be a self. You could say out of our insecurity and out of our basic confusion, then solidifying the quality of cognition into an agenda of self. And in relation to the self, then there is this construction of other, the object. And in this way, we have the dualistic condition, which then forms what we call kleshas, which is then the continual project of the self to secure what is desirable and avoid what is undesirable. And in this way, there's continually this situation of like and dislike. All of it perpetuates an experience of a solidified self and a solidified other. And this drives then a toxic situation, which ultimately is delusional. Ultimately, if we analyze, it's non-existent. Both subject and object cannot be found. But nevertheless, within the experience of that, we then solidify these patterns of action on the basis of our likes and dislikes, the kleshas, and this then becomes what we call karma. So it's this dualistic confusion that drives the two main causes of samsara, which are then the kleshas, the toxic states of mind, aversion, attachment, ignorance, pride, and jealousy, and the actions that come from these attitudes. And these are then what drives the various experiences of samsara. And what we're going to be looking at now, in the next chapter, is exactly these various realms. And that's where we would understand these realms in terms of the cause of these realms, which are the subjective psychological conditions, and also in the actual way that they manifest in terms of a solidified sense of realm and a solidified sense of identity as a sentient being inhabiting a particular samsaric realm. And that's where, of course, particularly in the modern context, it's very skillful to approach this in terms of understanding the psychology. But at the same time, also, it's important to realize that we're not just talking about sort of a gentle psychological experience as we have it here in the human realm, where we have definitely various ups and downs, and we can say we can experience the various 6 realms in terms of our human condition. But usually we're anchored within this, you could say, familiar ground of the human experience. Whereas at the time of death, then we inevitably begin to shape our embodiment and our future realm on the basis of what really exists within this subjectivity and what we call the all ground of our conscious existence, the alaya vijnana. And that's where then we talk about actual experiences of places, just like I'm presently in Australia and I experience Australia as a very real place, and so forth, myself as this particular person, and on that basis we have an experience of a real world. So that's where we talk about the realms of samsara as certainly founded as creations of the mind, but also playing out in terms of a very real experience of person and realm. Anyway, all of these come about not on the basis of some creator that is essentially driving the whole sort of the whole existence, but very much, and also not just seeing as a random occurrence that just happens in a random meaningless universe, but exactly on the basis of our subjective material, which is what we call then stored in what we call the all ground. We then have this delusional journey that is samsara. And that's all on the basis of this failure to understand reality. And on the basis of that, essentially what we perceive entirely informed of our delusion, entirely in terms of this deluded mind that fixates on a self, constructs the other, perpetuates these toxic experiences in terms of likes and dislikes, and on the basis of that, various realms, some of which are higher realms, some of which are lower realms, and predominantly within samsara, unfortunately, because of our drive towards what is negative, then we generally tend to create negative patterns that drive the lower realms. So we would say the lower realms of, there's far more sentient beings in the lower realms than in the higher realms. But of course, what we have right now is actually an extraordinary situation where we can actually choose. So the whole point of the law of karma, like I've been saying a few times, is not about instilling some sort of fear about our reality, but more actually appreciating the empowerment that lies in our present situation, in which we can actually not only understand the laws that drive the experience of happiness and the experience of suffering, and as such avoid what drives suffering and engage in what drives the positive, but we can also free ourselves altogether from this delusion, which is entirely what the Buddha wished. So very often when we have the representation of samsara, we see the Buddha standing outside pointing to the moon, and that's where essentially the Buddha is indicating that we should aspire for liberation from samsara altogether. Meanwhile, within the present discussion here, we're really more talking about simply the actions that drive higher and more comfortable experiences, higher realms. And these are then, until now, last time and the time before, we discussed the 10 negative actions, and essentially the 10 virtuous actions are the opposite, engaging in the 10, you could say, avoiding the 10 non-virtues is then what we call you could say in principle are then the 10 virtues, but as we'll see, it's a bit more than just not doing the negative actions. It also comes about with actually being proactively, consciously engaging in virtuous actions. So that's where we are then now we'll be looking at the reasons why then Jigme Lingpa encourages us to engage in the 10 virtuous acts and to avoid the 10 non-virtues. So of course, as modern people, we're very often burdened by a little bit of a sort of cultural prejudice against the whole idea of embracing virtue. It doesn't sound that sexy. It's sort of the idea of religiosity or moralism that sometimes in modernity is seen as being redundant and not really founded on, you would say, sound science. But here, in understanding the science of cause and effect in terms of our mind, then it's very much a real discussion, and it's very much, in fact, something that most of us live with, even though it's not something that's, you say, part of a scientific discussion. It's very much something that all of us live with in terms of choosing actions that are actually constructive and avoiding actions that are, not that are destructive. So anyway, on the basis of these 4 lines, then Kangyur Rinpoche comments, because deluded perception is taken to be concrete reality. The appearances of high and low existences occur. While beings are under the influence of such illusions, the 10 virtuous actions propel them into the higher realms. Consequently, Jigme Lingpa urges us to turn away consciously from the 10 negative actions and embrace the 10 virtues. So again, this is something which is in some way quite logical intuitively, but here then we're quite specific about how we really define then these virtue and non-virtue. And that's where another commentary on the Treasury of Precious Qualities from Khenpo Yönga reads, with regards to these 10 negative and 10 virtuous actions, he says, the mere failure to commit the 10 negative actions without having a conscious spirit of restraint is considered indeterminate. In other words, karmically insignificant. I'll return to that. Positive behavior is defined as the mind's conscious intention to reject negative practices and to adopt their opposites. These are the active protection of life, the practice of generosity, the perfect observance of the vows, the speaking of the truth, the reconciliation of disputes, peaceful and disciplined speech, speaking what is consonant with Dharma, satisfaction with little, loving attitude towards others, belief in the doctrine of karma, and so on. So, for example, if we happen to just walk by a colony of ants and we don't kill the ants, there's actually not particularly the virtuous act of not, you could say, restraining from killing these ants, or, you know, just because we didn't actually have the thought to not kill the ants or to kill the ants, or whatever, then that's where that would be, you could say, karmically insignificant, and because it is actually indeterminate in the sense that there's not really any choice or thought for or against. The moment that somebody is going to go in and say, let's exterminate this ant nest, and we then say, no, let's actually not do that. Let's see if there's another alternative to destroying this ant's nest. And that's where we actually then are doing something that is about protecting life and so forth. And that's where also, for example, in the case of having an ant problem, you might find skillful ways. I used to have a friend when I was living in France, in Dordogne, a woman who would actually, when the ant season came along, she would go in and she would talk to the ants. This was at La Sonnerie. And she would actually, you know, we actually noticed that this helped. This woman had powerful speech and the ants just would go away. And likewise, also, you know, there are things you can do. You could put, for example, a bit of I remember when Kangyur Rinpoche would visit La Sonnerie, we'd actually put some, or not I, but, you know, the skillful people would put a little bowl with marmalade, or jam, outside Kangyur Rinpoche's room. And so Rinpoche would never have ants in there. They would just all be happily feasting on the marmalade outside, and so forth. Putting an effort into actually doing something rather than just we happen to not kill somebody or we happen to not steal something and so on. That doesn't necessarily qualify as being proactive. And that's what we mean with indeterminate. The Tibetan term for this is lungmaten, which actually means that there's no intention behind it. And that's also something that we sometimes in the spiritual path would say, well, just because there's a peace of mind doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything really spiritual taking place. Just because you have a blank mind or you're not thinking anything or not doing anything, it doesn't necessarily, you know, qualify as virtue. Actually, in Danish, you know, den der sover synder ikke. That actually means that those who sleep, they're not sinning. Yeah, that's true, but they're not particularly. You know, we would joke saying those who sleep, they don't sin, and hence they go to heaven. Well, that's not really it. The thing is, what would presumably propel you to heaven is virtuous actions. So that's where just not doing negative actions doesn't necessarily constitute virtuous actions. That's the point that's being made here. And so as such, then virtuous actions are defined in terms of, like Khenpo Yönga here says, you know, the observance of the vows, you know, our spiritual discipline, speaking the truth, reconciliation of truth. And you can see disputes. These are all the opposites of the the 10 negative actions, but in terms of not just abstaining from negative actions, but being proactive in terms of positive actions. So, quoting the Nagarjuna, it is said in the Ratnavali that virtuous action delivers beings from birth in the health and the realms of pretas and animals. It brings them to the bliss of the divine and human realms and gives them the opportunity to experience the pure joy of the samadhis and limitless formless absorptions. So that's really taking, you could say, the samsaric condition and the virtue to its max, which is then being born in the higher realms, the divine and human realms, and then particularly within the divine realms, even the spiritual dimensions of samadhi. And that's again where even samadhi, from the Buddhist point of view, as much as it might be a sort of a condition of bliss for eons and eons, it's actually not free from the basic ignorant, the projection and the basic ignorance that fails to understand the nature of mind and still clings on to a sense of self. So however much we work on a spiritual project, if it's still all about me, if it's still just attached to, I am experiencing bliss, this actually would still contain the cause of suffering. So it's not really viewed as freedom from samsara. So then Jigme Lingpa then in terms of the a recapitulation of the path of beings of lesser scope. So that's when we then now are looking at sort of going towards the end of this discussion about the beings of a lesser scope, those that just wish the happiness of samsara. And there Jigme Lingpa says, of these, the 10 that lead to happiness cast beings into realms of bliss. 10 evil actions throw them down into states of loss. To undertake or spurn such deeds, thus known as white or black, defines the path of lesser beings. So we understand what brings happiness, what brings suffering, to undertake what it is, to undertake the white actions that bring higher realms, to spurn the black actions that bring about lesser realms, is really then the scope of the lesser beings, and this constitutes then, say, the scope of the whole moralistic or ethical, the practice of ethical action, which is essentially is what drives about, you could say, well-being or suffering. So this is not just in the spiritual context, but this is also basic to, you could say, social contracts and the general, you could say, running of societies, is when there's a clear understanding of what are the actions that bring happiness, what are the actions that bring suffering. And so also that's basic to, say, very much the ethos of traditional societies in terms of teaching children what we need to do, what we need to avoid, and so forth, basic to our sort of understanding of how to successfully handle the human condition. So Kangyur Rinpoche then says, given the distinction between virtue and non-virtue as laid down in the teachings, it is important to rely on virtue. The 10 virtues tending to happiness will produce happy destinies, while negative actions will precipitate a fall into the states of loss. To understand this distinction correctly, according to the karmic law of cause and effect, and to adopt positive rather than negative behavior, is the so-called path of beings of lesser scope. It is written in the sutra, those who have this perfect view, this perfect attitude according to the world, for thousands of their lives to come, will not sink down to evil destinies. So this is then the understanding of what really constitutes the causes of suffering and what are the causes of happiness, and simply avoiding what brings about these suffering conditions, then to act accordingly. And then very often we have, you say, naturally persons who have these inclinations, and that's where we say once we lay down the patterns of being inclined to virtue, it somehow rings true in terms of our well-being and in terms of relating successfully to the world around us, brings about positive perceptions of self and other, and that's where you could say there's a pattern that then is perpetuated. And so we talk about this as being something that can go on for a very long time, whereas we also could see the opposite. Those that are inclined towards non-virtue then are looking at then that kind of pattern and that kind of, subsequent experience. So all of that really defies what very often is sort of the rather misunderstanding that karma means that something is predestined. We say, oh man, that's just his or her karma. That's not at all something that is easily understood, because it lends itself to an understanding that there's some sort of predestination, that it's sort of written that it has to be in a particular way. And of course, what we're doing on the path is taking into consideration that, yes, we have a particular patterning, but we can break free from it. And that's where the practice of Dharma is not necessarily easy, because it often is about us breaking free. So that's, you would say, the degree to which we practice the Dharma successfully, to the degree to which we have this condition of prajna or wisdom, then also to that degree there's the ability to actually not get caught up in patterning. And so as the practitioner of the path gradually evolves, then there's a greater and greater, you could say free will. There's a greater and greater freedom from the patterns of karma. Okay, so then how beings of medium scope practice virtue. So this still within the law of karma, then we're looking at a different approach. 41, 10 virtues, the samadhis and the formless concentrations, the 6 perfections, giving and the rest. All this is virtue that to liberation tends. It is the cause of sublime purity. All are gathered in 5 paths: accumulation, joining, seeing, meditation, no more learning. So this is then the spiritual path. That's where, yes, we practice on the path, the virtues, but in addition to that, then there's also the perfections, such as the 6 perfections, the 6 paramitas: generosity, discipline, patience, endeavor, meditation, and wisdom. And also there are the paths that are associated with that: the path of accumulation, the path of joining, the path of seeing, the path of meditation, and the path of no more learning, which is something that really extends across both what we would call the Hinayana and also the Mahayana. So Kangyur Rinpoche here comments. In contrast with this, virtue tending to liberation, the preserve of beings of median capacity, brings about a state of nirvana, free from all trace of obscuring karma and defilements. So this is about us not just acting according to, we say, the ethical impulse to be virtuous and create causes of happiness, but this is very much the path of liberation altogether, freedom from samsara. Virtue tending to liberation means the 10 virtues practiced in conjunction with the wisdom of realizing the non-existence of the personal self. So this is all along the lines within the Buddhist teaching, right from the word go, really. We talk about this non-existence of the personal self. And that is where we speak about anatta or anatman. That in the Buddhist teaching, the Buddha's insight was that this self that we hold on to for dear life and which drives pretty much every action and every micro moment, it actually doesn't exist. And so the very foundation for our actions in terms of just our own sort of well-being and so on is actually delusional. And that is what Vipassana sees. That is the insight that the Buddha actually wishes us to have. This is not about the Buddha thinking you go into a particular zone in which you're going to be, you don't have any sense of yourself. It's not that. We investigate. Is there really a self? Doesn't really exist. And right from the beginning of the whole of the Buddhist teaching, this is what we understand, that these moments of consciousness that we hold to be a continuity that constitutes a construction of self actually is baseless. This self is imputed on conditions, but in fact, these shifting conditions really mean that there is no continual self. So this is then something that is engaged in terms of the path and engaged in terms of the practice of meditation. Kangyur Rinpoche says it refers also to the practice of the 4 samadhis of form and the 4 formless absorptions, together with the 6 virtues of generosity, discipline, patience, diligence, concentration, and wisdom. So again, these are then the general foundations of the path. The footnote here says, the Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas practice all these 6 virtues, but without the complete wisdom of emptiness and the skillful means of bodhicitta. For this reason, the paramitas, or perfections, is not used. So in that sense, the familiar 6 virtues, which we know from the 6 paramitas, in the case of the Hinayana, what we here refer to as the Shravakayana, Pratyeka Buddhayana, they really are understood in the sense of just virtuous actions that will bring about the results of the path in terms of peace, freedom from samsara. So Kangyur Rinpoche says, these 6 then are to be implemented at the same time as abandoning all that goes against them. So again, we discern between what we need to avoid and what we need to embrace. So all this is encompassed in the 5 paths. On the path of accumulation, the practice of virtue consists primarily in the reception and study of the teaching. On the path of joining, the main practice is that of meditation, though this is still on the mundane level. On the path of seeing, the no self of person is directly realized, while on the path of meditation, the principal training is in egolessness and discipline. When all these virtues have been fully practiced and accomplished, the path of no more learning is attained. In other words, virtue tending to liberation refers to the stainless merit accumulated on the 5 paths. So in the Mahayana also, we talk about the 5 paths, but still, just like with the six virtues here, it's the 5 paths which understand the selflessness of person, and as such, the freedom from the ordinary toxicity and confusion and neurosis and the patterning of a belief in a self, but it still fails to properly understand the absence of self in terms of all reality. So there's still some subtle, what we call cognitive obscuration. So that's what we define as the Hinayana, those that essentially aspire to freedom from the anguish of samsara and who then aspire to a personal peace. So this, from the Mahayana perspective, that's legit. It's okay. It's like you're not quite getting there, but you can't blame anybody if after, countless eons in samsara, then you'd like to sort of have a break. And so it's really understood in terms of if you're crossing the ocean, you might come across an island, a beautiful island in which you can find, reprieve from the suffering of samsara, and you want to just stay there. So you're not getting to the other shore exactly, but you're finding peace. There is the general notion that even when those who achieve this result, what we call the result of cessation, nirod or gokpa, they eventually, there is, you could say, the quality of Buddha nature that manifests, and at one point, then there is something that awakens. Anyway, how beings of great scope practice virtue. So this is then looking at the actual path of liberation, the actual path of the Bodhisattvas, and that's where then Jigme Lingpa writes. When realization of the non-existence of the twofold self is one, all virtue wherein skillful means and wisdom are conjoined, is like a gold-producing alchemy that strikes upon the leaden state, wherein existence and nirvana contradict. Buddhahood, the primal wisdom that abides in no extreme, is thus achieved. Virtue such as this transcends the world. So that's where, at the level of the Mahayana, the level of the Bodhisattva path, then there's a complete understanding that the nature of all these appearances is entirely shunyata. It's entirely free from anything that can be objectified or grasped, and the entire delusion of duality, self and other, falls apart. And this is from understanding the non-existence of the twofold self. There's an understanding of how the subjective dimension of consciousness doesn't entail a self, how the appearances of the objective world doesn't entail solid phenomena. And so on the basis of integrating all the perceptions, which we then do on the basis of the skillful means of the path that takes into consideration our particular style and our particular, you can say, dispositions and so forth, and the wisdom that sees this absence of self. On the basis of that, then the ordinary perceptions are then purified. And this is what we refer to then in terms of an alchemy, that all of a sudden what appears in the ordinary, in the scope of the ordinary impure projections is actually seen to be nothing but the pure display, and as such something that has never moved from the originally uncontaminated nature of reality. So that's where, as such, we're free from the whole notion of samsara and nirvana, the notion of being one afflicted by the condition of confusion and getting out of the confusion. That whole predicament is freed altogether. And that's where we arrive at this condition, which is seeing reality, which lends itself neither to samsara nor nirvana, lends itself neither to confusion nor freedom from confusion. As such, doesn't exist in the nature itself. There's no notion of, the nature is not contaminated with confusion, so it doesn't have a notion that there should be sort of elimination of the confusion. Confusion is entirely external to reality, and as such, the project of eliminating confusion, the project of nirvana, is entirely a construct that's basing on confusion in the first place. So as such, reality itself, the primal wisdom, has never been touched by confusion. It doesn't have any notion or carry with it any notion of that something needs to be eliminated or abandoned. And so arriving at the original condition of reality altogether is then what we call the wisdom that abides in no extreme. It's not something that's constructed or created in any way. It's simply just the ground of reality. And this kind of virtue that goes beyond any kind of dualistic, construction altogether is what we call the virtue that transcends the world. So this is going into something that defies the ordinary conventions about reality in which we ordinarily think, but then again, not based on some sort of belief, but really based on our insight, us investigating reality and properly understanding the nature of reality. And that's where the bodhisattvas, they actually do what all the other paths they do. They investigate reality, but there's a place where sometimes we would say the investigation doesn't go, in the case of the Hinayana, the Pratyeka Buddha, the investigation doesn't go far enough. It's understanding that we are constructed by moments of consciousness, and then, but still this consciousness is taken to be real, where actually if we investigate that consciousness itself, it itself also is a construct. It doesn't have any reality. Similarly also with the phenomenal world, where we, even within ordinary physics, we understand that it's created on the basis of particles and so forth. And that's where if we investigate further, that analysis that takes us to understanding that perceptions of phenomena, they essentially are constructs on the basis of, you could say, various conditions. If we take that analysis all the way, we actually see that even the foundations, the particles or whatever we might call it, these in and of themselves also are just labels, us labeling, you're going to say, the building blocks of phenomena. That's just us giving phenomena a particular label, but in and of itself, there is no reality behind it. So this is also something you'd say contemporary physics is onto, but it is a place where the Mahayana certainly comes then with this vast vision and this vast understanding that actually there's nothing in terms of neither the subjective nor the objective that can be ultimately objectified or grasped as real. So that's where the Mahayana really is defined in terms of a vast view of reality and also a vastness in terms of conduct. There's no longer this project of I need to secure myself in some ultimate comfort zone of nirvana. And that's where the bodhisattva aligns him or herself with this spirit of enlightenment, which is what we call bodhicitta, and which really signifies the whole Mahayana, which is that there's no longer any need to sort of secure this self. Of course, this needs to be understood within the context of the path, and it's not like all of a sudden we're going to sort of completely abandon our, you could say, caring for the very sort of the very being that who we are. But the Mahayana comes with this enormity of vision and also a corresponding courage, which is what we then on the path, we cultivate gradually through the practice of the path. So Kangyur Rinpoche here then comments, in the practice of beings of great scope, namely the bodhisattvas, there is no conceptual view, as there is with the Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, to the effect that there exist 10 virtues to be embraced and 10 non-virtues to be rejected. So of course, within the relative, we abide by an understanding of cause and effect, but there is this understanding that ultimately this constitutes relative truth, relative perception that ultimately, in fact, has no reality. So this is this vastness of vision, this great wisdom. And Kangyur Rinpoche then comments, by the application of great wisdom, bodhisattvas perfectly realize that all outer and inner phenomena are by nature empty, without self-identity, either personal or phenomenal. All aspects of the skillful means of compassion, that is, generosity and the rest, are sealed with the seal of emptiness. That means as we engage in the path, the application of this understanding of what we call twofold selflessness, we need to do this in terms of our, you could say, present actual experience in terms of relative truth. And that's where we begin then with the practices that relate to our immediate experience. And that's where we begin with actions that correspond to how we experience the world, but actions that also take us beyond that. And that's where the skillful means of the path is utilizing and making into a vehicle our perceptions of duality, our deluded perceptions, but actually taking us out of them. So the practice then of the 6 virtues, which then in this case referred to as the 6 paramitas, begins with generosity. And generosity is something that's very familiar to us in our world, giving to the others, but we can also see how it actually goes against the ordinary habitual pattern of securing self. If we were just to go with sort of the rudra, or the sort of self-centering of me, then it would always be about just grasping onto having and so forth. And we can see persons that do that effectively don't become happy. The sort of the hedonistic project, the self-centered project, the egotistical project is famously doesn't work. But it is the sort of basic primitive impulse of the self. And that's where, on the basis of understanding selflessness, we naturally, either through the analysis, you could say, that we have within the Buddhist science of understanding the twofold selflessness, or even just intuitively, in terms of us, you could say, societal condition, we understand the joy intuitively of giving. We enjoy the sort of the lightness that comes from freedom from self-centering. And so that's where the path accommodates this, you could say, natural disposition towards selflessness through practices such as then generosity. And then the further, you could say, further more profound practice of discipline, the further more profound discipline, practice of patience, endeavor, or energy, diligence, and meditation. So that we would say that these 6 paramitas are progressively more skillful, but they all conform to our particular experience and dispositions. That's why we're integrating that. We refer to that as skillful means. So the vision or the view or the wisdom, the vision of wisdom is one thing, understanding the nature of absence of self, but the application requires this skillful means of the engagement of the path. So Kangyur Rinpoche says, in this context, positive action in which skillful means are conjoined with wisdom is like the elixir of the alchemists. So when we engage, when we have this wisdom, the understanding of emptiness, we not only have it as an understanding, but we also engage it in our experience of life. That's where it completely transmutes, not just in terms of some idea, philosophical belief or opinion or whatever, but our whole being is transformed. So that's why we refer to this in terms of the sort of practice of alchemy, where actually what appears to be ordinary base iron ore or lead is transmuted into to gold. Now, the implication here is that our nature innately contains that gold and we fail to see it. But in the appearance, there is a transformation taking place. So you could say a sentient being that is transformed into a Buddha is essentially just someone that uncovers what they truly are. But on the other hand, from the outside, it would look extraordinary when on one hand you have a sentient being and all of a sudden you could say the base metal of a sentient being that all of a sudden stands out as the gold of a Buddha. So we can conventionally talk about this in terms of alchemy. So the practice then that's associated with that, Kangyur Rinpoche says, it transmutes into gold, the base metal of ignorance. Here, ignorance is understood as the failure to recognize that samsara and nirvana are equal, with the result that one conceives them in terms of opposite, with nirvana as something to be chosen and samsara as something to be rejected. So, of course, the very nature from which we could say samsara and nirvana originates is the nature of reality, which can be either understood or misperceived. So when it's misperceived, well, then we have the whole agony of samsara and the need for nirvana. But the nature itself is actually free from these opposites. The nature itself is free from any notion of samsara and nirvana. So Kangyur Rinpoche then says, the ultimate Buddha nature, the wisdom that abides in neither extreme of samsara and nirvana, is thus accomplished. And the form bodies of Buddhas, together with their activities, arise effortlessly, brought forth by supramundane virtue. So when the nature of reality is understood, then spontaneously the qualities that have been hidden, and that is the spontaneously present qualities of freedom and enlightenment, such as wisdom, compassion, strength, and all the qualities that we associate with the sage, but not only with the sage, but even in this world, we appreciate when there is clarity, when there is kindness, when there's selflessness, when there's, you could say, all the qualities that have to do with flourishing. They actually, you could say, are manifestations of not being held back by the ignorance of self-centering and the lack of perspective and so on. So in that sense, the natural outcome of unveiling this ground nature are then the display and the spontaneous presence of all the manifestations of enlightenment. So we talk about enlightenment in terms of these, in terms of kayas and in terms of dimensions, increasing the ways in which this dimension of enlightenment manifests in terms of our experience, in terms of our perceptions, and also in terms of the qualities of enlightenment, in terms of wisdom, the absence of confusion. So the Bodhicharya Avatara, the way of the Bodhisattva, says all these branches of the doctrine, the enlightened sage expounded for the sake of wisdom. So this is famously this first line in the 9th chapter, which actually understands that everything we're doing in the entire Buddhist path is really just relieving ourselves of this delusion. And that's what we call wisdom, prajna, that which is not bound by our ordinary habitual ignorance. And that's where then we talk about this ignorance as the base metal, that which is essentially drives confusion. And essentially everything that we do in the Buddhist teaching is to free ourselves from this condition of suffering, of ignorance that drives suffering. 43. While on the path, by means of concepts, merit is laid in, and wisdom free of such concepts also is amassed. When these two are conjoined, the two veils are removed and the two kayas manifest. Such is the interworking of profound and pure causation. So we would understand the Mahayana, the path of the Mahayana, in terms of the two accumulations. So again, this corresponds to, on one hand, the insight into reality, and the other hand, the skillful means that accommodates our experience, our relative experience. So that's where we, on one hand, talk about wisdom, and on the other hand, we talk about merit. But again, merit we need to understand in terms of being more than just good karma. It's not just that it propels us into higher realms, even though it does that, but it also connects us with liberation. So that's where the practice of merit is, you can say, the relative actions that actually connect us with enlightenment on the basis of our relative experience. And wisdom is the insight, the direct insight to the nature of reality. So the path is really defined in terms of these two, you could say, the joining of skillful means and wisdoms, or what we call then the two accumulations. So on the basis of that, then there is the two kayas that are realized, which is the kaya, that the dimension of lack of confusion, that is knowing reality as it is, and also with no longer being bound in terms of just self and me and so forth, the lack of obscuration, there's the natural condition that responds to the needs of sentient beings. And that's why we would say, on one hand, you have the Dharmakaya of the Buddha, the body of truth that knows reality for what it is. And then there's also the body of manifestation, or the body of form, that's there in terms of the others. And that's why we would say that from the body of truth, or the Dharmakaya, there spontaneously is the spontaneous compassion that is there for the benefit of sentient beings. So, so in this way, the Mahayana really is understood in terms of, we would say, the ground is the two truths. We'll look at this later. The path of the two accumulations, and the result are the two kayas. So this is really how we understand the scope of the entire path. Kangyur Rinpoche then here comments. He says, those training in the four paths of the Mahayana accumulate merit through the dualistic practice of generosity and so forth, that is to say, in post-meditation. So, okay, the four paths, well, there's still the five paths. We just leave out the last path, which is essentially Buddhahood. So in terms of just the path itself, we talk about it in terms of the path of accumulation, the path of joining, the path of seeing, and the path of meditation. So that's the same thing. There we accumulate merit through the dualistic practice of generosity, and that is the skillful means in which we actually engage our relative perceptions, and that is what the Bodhisattva experiences in post-meditation. We would say the Bodhisattva practicing meditation remains in principle free from the conceptual constructs of duality. So that's, you could say, a condition in which there's no duality. But while this gradually is refined through the sort of the progressing along the path of the bodhisattvas, the 10 levels and what have you, this is gradually less and less. We would still say that the bodhisattva still experience a dualistic perception up to a very high level on the bodhisattva path, and that's where all along then the bodhisattva accumulates merit. So Kangyur says, but the fact that the practice itself is considered to be illusory, in other words, that it is associated with a non-dualistic wisdom that realizes that subject, object, and action are without real existence, means that the accumulation of wisdom is accomplished at the same time. So when we talk about paramita, we're talking about actions that actually lead us towards this dismantling of the delusional constructs of subject, object, and action. So that's where the difference between a sentient being and a sage is really that we sort of strongly hold on. Let's say I give $5 to a noble cause, then I think, oh, I gave $5 to that cause. I hope they recognize me. I hope they thank me, and so forth. So that's where you can say there's strings attached with certain kinds of giving, right? What signifies the bodhisattva's freedom from that is the bodhisattva gives without having the thought that I am giving to so-and-so. That's the beauty of the bodhisattva. So we, in the ordinary perceptions, we know the difference between when we receive a present where there's somebody sort of waiting to be thanked and congratulated, and, or we give and we're expecting something back, sort of, when's it, And what are you giving me? You know, that sort of thing. Strings attached. It looks like generosity, but it sucks because it's still caught up with this, essentially, this threefold concept of subject, object, and action. And there's something incredibly beautiful about the giving that's free from that. And so that's where the wisdom that sees reality, in fact, is free from these, you can say, artificial constructs. So Kangyur Rinpoche says, as one grows increasingly habituated to the practice of these two accumulations of merit and wisdom inseparably united, the two kinds of obscurations, emotional and cognitive, are purified, and the two kayas, Dharmakaya and Rupakaya, are actualized. So the two kinds of obscurations is this, essentially the ground is the cognitive obscuration of duality that thinks in terms of self, other, this, that, and so forth. And what comes with that is then the emotional obscurations, because once there's this concept of this duality, there's a concept of self. Once there's a concept of self, there's like likes, dislikes, and essentially all the kleshas. And then again, we have the further, you could say, the further sort of, it plays out further in terms of the karmic obscurations. But at the core, really, we talk about these two kinds of obscurations: the ground of confusion, which is the cognitive obscuration, and the emotional obscurations upon that. And when these are purified, when the ground itself, the cognitive obscuration, is purified, then this is the freedom from delusion altogether, which is the Dharmakaya, the body of truth. And from that, then, where we know where the confused condition constructs a self that is sort of very tied up with the energy of wishing to consolidate me in terms of what I want and don't want, that energy is freed. And there's the natural playing out of the warmth and the compassionate nature that responds to the needs and the awareness of others. So that's then the manifestation body of enlightenment, which is the Rupakaya. So Kangyur Rinpoche then again quotes the Ratnavali, where it says, the Buddha's forms arise from stores of merit, while, if briefly told, the form of truth is born from kingly treasuries of wisdom. So on the basis of all the merit the Bodhisattva accumulates on the path, there's the ability to manifest effectively for others, while the wisdom that sees reality for what it is, this is what then drives the kaya or the dharma kaya of awakening. So in fact, this refers to these two dimensions or kayas of enlightenment: the seeing of truth and the manifestation of compassion. The Kangyur Rinpoche says, from the absolute point of view, beyond all conceptual construction, the karmic principle of cause and effect is a mere imputation. The fact that the process of cause and effect, as this is asserted in the common vehicle, has no true existence, points to the profound principle of dependent arising, which ordinary people find difficult to understand. Okay, time is up. I'm going to just, rather than sort of just rushing through this point here towards the end, we'll sort of complete that next time. We'll just go over this again, essentially the two accumulations and the two kayas. Yeah, there might be some. Let's just see if there's some questions here. From where the impulse to be self-oriented comes from ignorance. That is really the core problem of samsara. It's not that anybody has done anything bad, but it's that there's just simply ignorance. Just like when we are caught in a dream, we believe that our identity in the dream and all our perceptions in the dream is real, but they're actually not real, but we perceive them as such. So the condition of the sentient being comes about through this original ignorance. Could you say something about vows and the accumulation of merit, please? Well, that's actually what Kangyur Rinpoche was talking about. We could actually just do meritorious actions, but when vows is where we actually are determined to do something good. So that's something that is consciously committing ourselves. So that's really where you could say virtuous actions become something more than just doing, you could say, there's more than just abstaining from negative actions, and there's more just than doing good actions. But if it's informed by a vision, which in the Shravakayana and Pratyeka is an understanding of what drives the freedom from suffering, and in the Mahayana is the intention to ultimately liberate all sentient beings. These then inform the value of these particular actions. So when we take vows, then you could say the more profound and the greater the intention is, then the greater the merit also is. So we need a lot of merit to get to a place where merit no longer exists. Well, yes, you could say that. I mean, within the relative perceptions that we have, then we work on essentially creating the causes for that which lies beyond cause and effect. So you can say that. Mange tak. How can one describe ignorance? Not as a pig, but as state of mind. Well, simply just like I said before, like in a dream. So it's like, it's not as if we're stupid as such, but we just don't know. So it's really just a condition, a very innocent condition that nevertheless drives very painful experiences. So that's where it's not as if there's any, you could say there's actually no value judgment in the notion of ignorance. It's not like sentient beings are bad and Buddhas are good, but it's just that sentient beings, due to their ignorance, due to their delusion, they're caught up in a painful condition. But it's not as if anybody's punishing them. It's not as if they've done anything bad, simply just from ignorance. And that we should understand actually applies to all the negativity that we see in the world, especially when we're sitting getting upset about the politicians and we think they're intrinsically bad. Yeah, their decisions might be uninformed, bad, negative, involved, you could say, ripples of suffering and so forth, for sure. But at the same time, the basic core of any sentient being is actually a core of purity, what we call Buddha nature. So that's why we understand that ignorance is merely just a failure to understand this Buddha nature. Wow, it is so sad, indeed. All right. Well, on that note, then with sympathy for the condition of sentient beings, we will conclude with dedication. Okay. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we are born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. Thank you very much. Oh, just an announcement. I think from the beginning the 19th of March, I think we're going to relegate this study to the Saturdays, because actually what we're going to do on Sundays is something that's it's a new course that's going to be we'll be presenting. It's predominantly teaching children, but a whole group, actually a whole team of persons that will be presenting a program that's founded on Tsongsa Gyalme Khyentse Rinpoche's work, Living is Dying. And it's very much about how we should understand, how we can approach the whole fact that we're not going to be here forever, and how we can, essentially prepare and understand and so forth, also assist others around the whole process of death. So that's going to be running on the same time on Sundays. And I was initially thinking that this would replace this study, but I'm thinking maybe why not just do this study on Saturdays? So the Sunday is being given to this very important study, Living is Dying. But I think we'll continue then on Sundays. So since the other course will begin March the 20th, then we'll at that time then begin to do these studies of the Treasury of Precious Qualities on Saturday. So we'll begin from from March 19, we'll begin to do this same time on Saturdays. So, okay, just so you know. All right. Thank you.